Welcome to Thomas Fazi from Rome, writer and critic, who I also met in Tolfa. And I'm very happy to have you on Steigan NO today, Thomas. We have a lot of things to talk about, but today I want you to elaborate on one of your pieces where you wrote about the probable or possible split in Europe. Will Europe have to split? It's a theme that fascinates me very much. When I edited your piece, I put in a map of the reign of Charlemagne, King Charles the Great, and some of the fault lines from his time, particularly the Elbe in Germany, is still there. It's still there. So this fascinates me very much, and we can go into this. But I want you now to elaborate on your view on the conflicts in Europe, especially now related to the war in Ukraine.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Paul, for the invitation on Steigan, which I consider to be one of the best outlets out there. I read it religiously every morning at 8:03 when it comes into my mailbox, almost in the exact same time every day. So it's a real pleasure. Well, yes, I mean what I speak about in the piece is that how on top of the many divisions that already that have troubled, I wouldn't say so much Europe per se. Let's talk about the European Union that have troubled the European Union pretty much since its inception, but especially following the Euro crisis. So for the past decade or so, which has mostly been a kind of north-south divide, or at least has been described as a north-south divide, as a mainly, relating to the economic differences and the kind of the increased divergence between the European core, the economic core, and so the kind of central northern Germany-led economic bloc, which, as we know, has benefited quite a bit from the euro because its own economic model is well suited to the euro. It's very much an export-led economic model, and how that in contrast, the countries of the periphery and the countries of Southern Europe especially have actually lost out from the euro, and so this has been the main, I would say, the main divide that has characterized EU politics for most of the past decade, and it's what I've written extensively about that, and I think that already pointed to many of the European Union's, I would say, intrinsic structural problems, in a sense that in its public narrative, the European Union purports to represent, reflect, and express the common interests of, or some European common interest, or at least that's what the public narrative has always said. But in fact, what these what the Euro crisis and what followed taught us is that there is no, in economic terms, there is no Europe, quote unquote. There are many Europes, there are many countries with conflicting interests, with conflicting even economic models and development models, some of which, have, more or less benefited from the European Union and the Euro, others which have not. And so, when people wonder why the European Union hasn't been able to evolve, to become more of a global protagonist, why hasn't it been able to develop a single voice on a number of issues? Well, that's because there is no single European interest. There are conflicting capitalist interests and the conflicting interests between nation states. And on top of that, there are also, even simply within Western Europe, and so even simply if we take Western, Germany and Italy, there are cultural differences as well, and the two issues are related. There are, of course, obviously linguistic differences and so on. And so all of this has led to the emergence of several divides, several fractures within Europe. Well, pretty much ever since it was created. What we're witnessing is the emergence of yet another fracture, which possibly even bigger than any of the other divides that we've talked about.
Yes. May I stop there a little bit? Because if you go back a generation with the fall of the Soviet Union, around about 1990, I remember in all of Europe there was a huge illusion about now there is going to become a unity from Lisbon to Vladivostok, and everybody will join hands and we will have peace forever after. Even at that time, you could easily see that was absolutely an illusion, since what happened with the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, was that the result of the two world wars came into play. Both the peace treaty of Versailles and the Yalta Conference both came into play, and so all of this conflict came up again. And a Norwegian professor used to talk about there is a shadow of Rapallo hanging over Europe, because the Americans and the British, they have been very afraid of Germany and Russia joining hands like they did in Rapallo. And so we see all of this conflict coming up. So, and I know some people on the, you can say, quasi-left in Italy. They believed very much in the Ventotene thinking and the United Europe and all that. How is that now in Italy? How do you see it from Italy?
Well, yes. I mean, I've been sort of growing increasingly estranged from the Italian left and the European left more in general for several years. This was even before the whole COVID affair, which set me even further apart from them. But even well before that, I've always been quite astounded by the left's approach to the European Union, or at least the contemporary left's approach to the European Union. Historically, I would say that the socialist and communist left had a fairly solid understanding of what the European Union was. Even in Italy, if we look at, so I'm always surprised. I've always been, quite surprised by the way the debate is framed, not just in Italy, but more in general in Europe, whereby what today, what is considered sovereignism, and so the defense of national sovereignty vis-a-vis the European Union is considered a right-wing position. When in fact, I always tell people, I mean, the most sovereignist party in Italy's post-war history is the Italian Communist Party, which is the only party that voted against every European treaty, all the way back from the Treaty of Rome of 1957 up to the Maastricht Treaty, even though by then it wasn't called the Communist Party anymore, but an offshoot of the Communist Party, the Fondazione Comunista, voted against the Maastricht Treaty. And so, the Communist Party has been consistently against the European Union because it understood quite well what that project was, and that it was a project led by elite interests. It was a project led by big capital, which aimed at sort of transferring the decision-making process from the national level, where citizens theoretically or potentially are able to exercise some degree of control over those decisions through the the mechanisms of representative democracy, transfer that process to a supranational level, which would be completely insulated from democratic, from democratic pressures, democratic control, democratic influence. And they realized that this was an intrinsically anti-popular, anti-labor, and especially anti-socialist policy, because socialists, more than anyone else, in order to implement socialist policies, you have to be able, the state needs to control, needs to have a whole series of, tools through which to govern the economy, govern the markets, control the markets. But if you take all these tools and you transfer them at the supranational level, then that means that, the implementation of socialist policies is never going to be possible. And of course, this was one of the aims of the European Union. And so the left, up until the 1980s, I would say, in Italy and elsewhere, had quite a clear understanding of this. Then something happened at some point, and and we end up in a situation that we've been in for the past few decades, where the left considers the European Union to be some form of internationalist dream. And I think that has to do with the left falling for a lot of the myths that the elites have spun about globalization. And so I think the left has bought into this narrative of the death of the nation state, of the idea that globalization entails necessarily the hollowing out of nation states, and that there is no alternative to this, to quote Thatcher, and hence all that we can do is try to pool the sovereignty of countries together at a supranational level and try to recuperate a bit of that influence and power that nation states have lost at the national level, at the supranational level. This has been kind of the left wing take on the on the Europeanist narrative. Of course, we know that now, to be so obviously false. We know that clearly by ceding sovereignty and power to the European Union, countries haven't become more sovereign. They've simply become less sovereign. They've simply and those countries have become less democratic, which means that the citizens that live in those countries now have almost hardly any ability to actually influence the economic policies of those countries. And so
sure. From a Norwegian point of view, I subscribe to what you say absolutely. Norway is the only country that has voted twice against the European Union, in 73 and 94. But today we are the most loyal member of the EU. We apply EU laws even before the European Parliament has decided upon them. So, and that is the work of especially the Social Democratic Party, that has made us a member of the European Union without being a member. So we can talk a lot about that, but I want to introduce this perspective that from the Norwegian left, it was strongly radical, strongly anti-fascist, and strongly independent. We wanted to be independent and voted against the EU twice, and so now we are in this mess. And even though left is supporting arms to Ukraine and everything of this, so it has been a tragic and dramatic shift also in Norway. You mentioned something that made me think a lot about the history. You touched upon the role of you can say Eastern Europe, and the role of how the US is playing Eastern Europe now against, you can say, the Western part of the European Union. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so you were mentioning earlier how a lot of people, especially in the aftermath of the Cold War, dreamt of a Eurasian geopolitical bloc from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And of course, it was people in the West that were thinking in these terms, in Western Europe, that were thinking in these terms. And I think so. Whenever someone purports to speak for Europe, in fact, it's usually whatever happens to be the hegemonic power in Europe at that moment that speaks for Europe as a whole. And so for many years, it was Germany speaking for Europe, under the assumption of what was good for Germany was good for Europe, even though that was clearly not the case. And so, of course, after the Cold War, it was Western European intellectuals and politicians that were mainly driving the narrative, of course, because it was only Western Europe that was in the EU at the time. And again, so it's completely ignored that between Lisbon and Vladivostok, there were a bunch of countries dividing Western Europe from Russia that might have had different ideas about this grand, Euro-Russian alliance. And in fact, tensions emerged very quickly, I would say, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe on the Russian issue. Clearly, that was one issue over which we've always had different views. First, for obvious historical reasons. I think the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have every reason, to have grievances against Russia. At the same time, the way a lot of Western Europeans have looked at Russia, even throughout the Cold War, it was very different. A lot of people in Western Europe have always felt that we have very strong cultural ties with Russia, and even ideological ties, especially in those countries that had once very powerful communist parties like Italy. There have always been very strong ties with Russia, driven also by this. Italy was a country in which 50% more or less of the country was communist. And so it's only natural that they looked favorably upon Russia. And of course, that plays out even today, even just in sense of Italy having maintained strong economic ties with Russia over the years, and so on and so forth. And and so I think, we've always been, I think, very superficial about these very, very deep differences that there were between Western and Central and Eastern Europe over the Russian issue, and on other issues as well, cultural issues too. And in fact, that's what we've been mostly talking about in recent years.
Could I add one point? From my point of view, it looks that even at least part of the capitalist class in Italy had good relations with Russia, like the Agnelli family, with Togliatti, Grad, etc., and the relations were not as bad at all, even on the capitalist level.
Absolutely. And now, it's not just the Agnelli. It's Italy is famous for its not so much for its massive corporations like Fiat, but more for its microcosm of small and medium enterprises, which have had very fruitful ties with Russia. Exports to Russia were a big deal for a lot of Italian manufacturers, which is why Italy has taken such a hit, and had already taken a heavy hit from the sanctions, even the anti-Russian sanctions, even before the conflict. Because of course, let's remember that the sanctions weren't initiated last year. Russia has been sanctioned for several years now, and Italy is one of the countries that has suffered the most from that. And so it's only natural that today that plays out into different views of the conflict. But going back to what we were saying, I think whereby especially Western European officials and intellectuals have, we're kind of tapering over these profound differences, especially vis-a-vis the Russian issue. Once again, kind of deluding themselves. The European Union has a history of delusion, of self-delusion and delusion. On the other hand, the Americans were very good at exploiting those differences. as you were mentioning, I mean, avoiding the emergence of a Eurasian geopolitical, geostrategic reality has always been an imperative for America. And America has always been very open about this. If you read Brzezinski's, what was it, 1997 book, what was it called, The Grand Chessboard or something like that. I mean, he speaks about it very explicitly, and that this is a semi-official American strategy, American policy imperative, and it has been pretty much, ever since World War II. What was it? An American general that said that the whole point of NATO was to keep, Western Europe in, Russia out, and Germany down. So it was all about keeping Europe divided and maintaining U.S. control over Europe. And so the Americans have been very good at exploiting these differences very early on in order to keep Europe divided. And so we all remember Rumsfeld's famous remarks about, and of course he was talking about the fact that Germany and France especially weren't supporting the U.S. intention of invading Iraq. And so Rumsfeld made that famous difference between the old Europe, i.e. Germany and France and Western Europe, which he was implying was increasingly less influential on the global scale, and the new Europe. And of course he was talking about Central and Eastern Europe, which was and he was implying that that's where the balance of power was shifting, because these were new, they were young, dynamic countries, and that the balance of power was slowly shifting to the east. And of course, this was just a way of getting those countries of kind of presenting the fact that these countries were all very supportive of America's plans for Iraq as a result of some grand historical shift in the balance of power in Europe, when in fact it was just the fact that these countries thought it was in their interest at that time to support the US, because they've always been very supportive of NATO. They've always felt that NATO was a crucial aspect of their security vis-a-vis Russia, and so they were simply pursuing what they perceived to be their interests. But America, was very good at amplifying these divisions, and so 20 years down the road, what we're seeing is those exact same divisions, of course, multiplied 1,000 times by what's happening in Ukraine. And so now what we have is really not just we don't just have a Western bloc and a Central Eastern bloc that has different tactical or even strategic divisions about what's best to do with regards to Russia and Ukraine. What we have are two almost existentially different visions about what Europe should be, what the future of Europe should be, and what the European Union should look like. And so on the one hand, you have sort of Macron's vision, and I don't think Macron is going to follow through with that, at all. So I think
he's not the goal.
Macron,
he's not the goal.
Macron, and try to distract people from the fact that he's got a massive uprising, in France over the pension reform and other problems, and he's just trying to strut about on the world stage a bit. But of course, the issues that he talks about are real. So of course, when he talks about Europe would be better off reducing its dependence on the US and on NATO, becoming more strategically autonomous, even in military terms, and so on and so forth, and that it shouldn't follow America down its new Cold War with China. I think it's certainly a point of view that I would agree with. It's a point of view that definitely a lot of ordinary people in Western Europe agree with. I would assume that some leaders privately agree with Macron, even though they might be they might have problems about taking that position publicly. But I mean, but objectively, it's pretty obvious that that's what Europe should do. I mean, it makes no sense for Europe to be completely, dependent in security terms, in defense terms, but even to a large degree in economic terms, in strategic terms, from America. 80
I mean, Europe doesn't have energy. It needs a market, etc.
Exactly, it's basic questions of survival, like clearly, and so it makes sense. I mean, that old project, the idea that there are, that it's almost it's natural for Europe, for Western Europe at least, to have cultural and economic ties with Russia, is still true today. And in fact, I would say today is more apparent than ever. It was a kind of a circular relationship that made very much sense in economic terms, buying natural resources from Russia, and then exporting back to Russia finished products, which the Russian sort of growing middle class, was needed. It made sense for everyone.
I want to bring you back to your argument about Rumsfeld and the two Europes, because I've been thinking a lot about the role of Poland in this, because in the 30s you had Piłsudski in quasi-fascist in Poland, and his vision was to create a two seas union, from the Black Sea to the Baltics, and even one of his visions of this included Finland, Scandinavia, and even Albania. So this was a kind of fascist, anti-Russian model, which is still alive in Poland today, and which also lays under, at least on the Western Ukraine fascist movement's thinking. I mean, this idea of Eastern Galicia and with the Baltic states, etc. How do you see Poland in all of this?
Well, I think Poland's role in this in this whole story is absolutely fundamental. So we know that Poland historically has always had, if we go way back, to the 15th and 16th century, it was a major power broker in the region. We know that it used to be engaged in an alliance with what was then Lithuania, which comprised much of what is today Ukraine, and so it was a very important power, a very important regional power, and even today we can see that Poland still has. Still aspires to play a leading hegemonic role in the regions and the central and even the northern quadrant of Europe, and it's been sponsoring many initiatives that go in this direction over the years. So we have, you mentioned the two C's. Now we have the 3 C's initiatives, so involving countries that overlook the Baltic Sea, the Adriatic Sea, and the Black Sea. But there are many other regional initiatives that Poland has been sponsoring or co-sponsoring over the years. We have the Bucharest 9 initiative. We have, of course, the Visegrad group, which is the most famous of these groupings that has emerged in recent years. And so we see a number of initiatives taken at the regional level in Central and Eastern Europe, many of which led by Poland, which are clearly aimed at increasing, to use Macron's term, the strategic autonomy of Central and Eastern Europe, vis-a-vis Russia on one side. So, of course, all these initiatives are driven on the one hand by serious security concerns about Russia. So they were about bolstering the Central Eastern, the eastern flank, and protecting that flank from what they've always perceived to be a Russian threat on the one hand, but they're also and they've also been quite explicitly aimed at containing Western hegemony, and especially German hegemony in particular, which a lot of those countries, especially Poland, are also historically concerned about, and Poland for obvious reasons. But that's always been a problem in other countries as well. And so you see all these initiatives aimed at kind of containing what, from the perspective of at least some countries in that region, is this double threat that they see as coming from the east on one side, Russia, and from the west on the other side is Germany, and the kind of EU project more in general, which they have started to view increasingly as an imperialist project in recent years. I would say even rightfully so. The EU has been increasingly assertive in its attempts to impose not only its kind of socially progressive values on Central and Eastern countries, which historically have different social values to Western Europe, but also its integrationist approach to politics. And so a lot of those countries, they saw the European Union as a strictly economic agreement about, it was about spreading markets and spreading, the free market and so on and so forth. So maybe they were a bit naive about what the European Union actually was. Once they figured out that the European Union was actually a project that aimed at slowly eroding the national sovereignty of member states, unlike Western European countries, which hardly reacted at all against this project, mainly because the Western European elites were on board with this project for domestic reasons. The Eastern European elites reacted very differently to this, and so they kind of there was very much a pushback against the European Union's kind of integrationist policies. And so in all this story, Poland is the protagonist, and I think Poland has. Of course, the main problem for Poland is that it's always been described as the kind of, the bête noire, the black beast of Europe. That's been the narrative up until last year. So Poland and Hungary were the bad boys. They were the illiberal countries, the post-liberal countries that were desecrating the Europe's values and so on and so forth. And so that that clearly represented an obstacle for Poland to some extent. But now with the conflict in Ukraine, what you have is a massive shift in geostrategic power to the east for obvious reasons. And so these countries that were disqualified and which some were even attempting to kick out of the European Union up until last year, have suddenly become the center of gravity in Europe at the moment, because those are the countries that they either border Russia or Ukraine, or they overlook the Northern Sea route, which is just as important. And of course, Poland realizes that this is a golden opportunity to exploit the situation to forward its plans for greater hegemony in the region, and it's been doing that quite effectively. And of course, it's the Americans are being very helpful, because clearly in this project, Poland and America have a common strategic interest.
You can see that very easily with the Nord Stream sabotage. It was demanded by Poland, and it was carried out by the US and probably also by Norway, and to the detriment of Germany. I mean, Germany was treated like slaves by their so-called allies, whereas Poland now is taking a pole position for the Americans. They are moving some of their resources from Germany to Poland, and whereas Germany is treated so badly, the Poles are put in a very favorable position by the Americans. And there you can also see some of this Anglo-American Polish alliance from before the Second World War.
Sure, absolutely. No, I mean, you can clearly see elements of continuity there, which Poland is exploiting very, very effectively. And what we've seen, the US has basically, has essentially made Poland the logistical and strategic hub for its operations, for NATO operations in Ukraine. It's made Poland the permanent headquarters for the US Fifth Corps, which essentially controls the the US Army's fifth eastern flank, and so there's no doubt that we have even quite a I would say a dangerous alliance between kind of the US, the most hawkish elements of the US establishment align with very strongly nationalistic elements in Poland and in Ukraine as well. I mean, there's even an open debate in Poland at the moment whether Poland and Ukraine should join into some kind of a confederacy or even a federal union at some point down the line. And of course that would create one of the biggest countries in Europe, and it would automatically bring Ukraine, or what's left of it, into NATO and into the European Union. So you would have this new country that is one of the biggest countries in Europe, and also one of the most militarized countries in Europe. It would, of course, be the NATO bastion in Europe. So you would have this massive kind of NATO base right in the heart of the central European heartland. So you can see how that would represent a big problem for Western Europe's desires for a bit more autonomy from the US and from NATO. So it is a very quite a worrying scenario, and I think in which I think, of course, much will depend on how long the war goes on for. Of course, it's easy to see also in terms of common strategic interests how Poland and the US both have an interest, and this is also quite worrying, for the war to drag on for a little longer. I mean, for as long as it can, without becoming too much of a problem for NATO. And I think that's clearly what the strategy still is at the moment, to keep the fighting going for as long as possible, because not just because they hope of weakening Russia. I think that's quite delusional, as we're seeing, but I think it's more about the fact that the conflict provides the perfect cover to implement this geopolitical strategy, this Polish US geopolitical strategy in the region. For as long as the conflict is ongoing, then they will have the perfect cover to continue with these plans for full remilitarization of the region. And of course, it's not just about Poland. I mean, this remilitarization strategy involves all the countries, all the way from the Baltic down. And I think in this new East-West dynamic, again, much will depend on how the situation evolves. But I think the Eastern European countries are in a much better position, in a sense that they have much more determined, willful elites than Western Europe has. So the Eastern European elites are clearly the kind of old school politicians, with visions of national sovereignty, which enjoy strong popular support, which ride on top of this strong, which are supported by this popular support which they have, and which have, I would say, ideological, historical, even spiritual reservoirs which they can, which they can turn to. We have none of that in Western Europe.
No. Western Europe doesn't have any leaders today. Absolutely none. There is no Charles de Gaulle. There is no leader, and the working class movement has been destroyed. I like often to look upon historic maps, because you see some of these conflicts, they are playing out over the same battlefields. When we saw they split Yugoslavia, a fascinating thing is that Yugoslavia was split along a limb, the dividing line between the Eastern and Western Roman Empire from the times of Diocletian. So it's quite a long stretch, and we see the same with Poland when they are launching this three Seas idea. It goes back to 1300 or something, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. So we see that new conflicts, new capital interests, they join up with these forces, and we do well to look at history into this, because all of these people look into history.
Absolutely. So, I mean, to conclude, I would say that from the perspective of Western Europe, at least, because that's inevitably the perspective that I adopt as a Western European, and I would say I adopt a specifically Southern Western European perspective, because I live in Italy, a Mediterranean country, which has its own interests, which overlap with the interests of other Western European countries on some aspects, and don't overlap on other aspects. I think the lesson here is, the main lesson we can take from all this is the complete failure of the European Union. And how the European Union has become a straitjacket. It's been an economic straitjacket for a very long time. Now it's become, on top of continuing to be an economic straitjacket, it's now become a geopolitical straitjacket as well, because it means that those countries that objectively need to break away from, American imperialism cannot do so within the context of the European Union. So a country like Italy has every interest in being a bridge with Northern Africa, in being a bridge with other Mediterranean nations, in being a bridge also with China, for
China,
obvious geographic regions. It's one of the access lines to Europe. And so it's in our interest to open up to the world, and to go beyond, to break out from this increasingly small island, and increasingly paranoid island that is the collective West. That means breaking away from US control, from US hegemony. And I think the emergence of this increasingly multipolar world that we are seeing is potentially a very good opportunity for countries like Italy, like France, if we are to take Macron seriously, like Germany too. These are all countries that, this is not, geopolitics isn't all about, it's not so much about opinions. There are some objective underlying facts that drive geopolitical dynamics. And so I would say a lot of Western European countries have an objective interest in opening up to the emerging multipolar reality, which means, of course, breaking away from US control. But that's something they can't do within the context of the European Union, because you will never reach the necessary consensus for doing that within the European Union. If anything, because of course you will get the veto of all the Central and Eastern European countries, which in fact favor a completely opposite strategy.
In the conclusion, I wanted to introduce China, because there are few countries that are so historically minded as the Chinese, and so they would say to you in Italy, yes, we had a very good relation with the family Polo way back then. So you will be invited back to the Silk Road.
Exactly.
You know, Thomas, this has been very fascinating. I think that we should pick up this idea of TOLFA Economic Forum and meet with some
Absolutely.
colleagues in TOLFA to develop these and other ideas further.
That would be fantastic. I look
So
forward to
thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Pål.
Have a nice time.
You too.